Hello, everyone. We will be singing a few songs tonight. They will be projected, but if you would like a hymnal and haven't gotten one, you have a minute here to go grab one. Gonna give Clay a minute here. Hello and welcome everyone to our fifth and final lecture in this series on Mennonite history. Thank you so much for being a part of this series. It's been a real blessing to share myself and to hear from a number of historians in the area. Tonight we'll be hearing from Dr. Andrew Suderman, whom I'll introduce a little more fully later on. First, I want to once again thank our sponsors, Shenandoah Valley Mennonite historians, who made this financially possible. Let's give them a round of applause. We'll be starting with a song. Please join me if you're able, and we'll sing number 22. What is this place? Again, in the hymnal, that's number 22. What is this place where we are meeting? Only a house, the earth its floor, walls and a roof, sheltering people, windows for light and open door. Yet it becomes a body that lives when we are gathered here. And know our God is near. Words from afar, stars that are falling, sparks that are storming us like sea. Names for our God, dreams, sons, and wonders sent from the past are what we need. We in this place remember and speak again what we have heard. God's free redeeming word. And we accept bread at his table, broken and shared, a living sign. Here in this world, dying and living, we are each other's bread and wine. This is the place where we can receive what we need to increase God's justice and God's peace. Okay, time for an introduction. Andrew Suderman serves as the Director of Global Partnerships for Mennonite Mission Network, as the Secretary for Mennonite World Conference's Peace Commission, and as an associate professor in theology, peace, and mission at Eastern Mennonite University. If you're counting, that is 3 jobs. Although born in Canada, Andrew has spent many years elsewhere, 10 years in Latin America, 7 in South Africa, and 8 years in counting in the United States. Through his different roles, Andrew seeks to explore how we embody our theological convictions and how our lived experience and journey affects the way in which we understand God's work and mission in the world. Throughout his life, Andrew has sought to balance the academy and the classroom on one hand, and ministerial and practical experiences on the other. He has worked with offenders and ex-offenders in both the provincial and federal penitentiaries in Canada. He has supervised a 54-bed homeless shelter and walked with and learned from South Africans as they continue to wrestle with their painful history of apartheid and how they can work towards a new, reconciled reality on a foundation of justice and peace. Dr. Suderman's PhD in theology explored South African political theology and how it intersects with Anabaptism. Andrew and his wife Karen have 3 wonderful, beautiful, and energetic children and live on a farmette outside of Harrisonburg called Little North Acres. Join me in praying for Andrew. Dear God, we come to you this evening, once again, eager to hear your word, to hear how you're calling us to continue in this journey of faithfulness. We thank you for your faithfulness towards us over the last 500 years. May we be spurred on this evening towards greater pursuit of the kingdom of justice and peace that you laid out for us. In Jesus' name, amen. Andrew requested that we sing him up to the stage, so we will be singing again, number 566, Somlandela. If you aren't familiar with the Zulu text, we'll sing once in Zulu and once in English. The Zulu is Somlandela, Somlandelu Yesu, and then the last line, Lafo Eyakona Somlandela. And again, if you would like to stand, I invite you to stand.
So in South Africa, when somebody comes up to speak, that the crowd would sing a song as that person would come up. And so today, as my hope is to look at and to be reminded of an Anabaptist vision and what we can learn from an Anabaptist vision from our global companions, I thought, well, Caleb, why don't we try doing something like this that we would do in South Africa? Good evening. It is good to see all of you, and it is good to be here with you this evening. Thank you very much for the invitation to share some reflections. This journey in exploring the birth and history of the Anabaptist movement throughout the centuries has been so rich. We began this exploration by listening to John Roth, who suggested a shift in the way in which we view and understand the emergence of the Anabaptist movement, shifting from seeing and depicting it as a restoration movement to seeing it rather as a renewal movement. John highlighted how the emergence of Anabaptism was, in many ways, special and significant. But the early Anabaptists drew on some of the ideas that were percolating around the same time, which helps us be a little bit more humble in the way in which we depict the emergence of the Anabaptist movement. We then had Mary Sprunger highlight the way in which already within the 2nd century, Anabaptists were in places and positions of wealth and privilege, challenging the tendency and characterization challenging the tendency of characterizing Anabaptism as a faith expression that has always been based on simplicity. Elwood Yoder shared how Anabaptists, even if they enjoyed positions of well-being, were also pressured because of their faith and the way that faith challenged some of the social norms of the places in which Anabaptists lived, resulting in Anabaptists becoming people who would regularly be on the move. Then last week, we heard Caleb's excellent and thought-provoking lecture that highlighted the ways Mennonites were affected by and leaned into modernization, wrestling with how to fit and how to belong, for example, through agreements of privilegia, while also sometimes wanting to be left alone so that they could govern themselves as separate from the world. Caleb's lecture also highlighted the ways in which largely because of war and socio-political turmoil, whether in Russia and Ukraine or the Civil War here in the US, Mennonites and those within the Anabaptist family continuously faced questions of enculturation, that is, the gradual acquisition of norms and assumptions of a particular social setting. We saw how these questions of enculturation particularly revolved around the birth pangs of statehood as nation states were forming and maturing. This evening, my hope is to build on the excellent stories and insights offered in the last few weeks and explore how this faith movement, which began in Europe and had largely remained in the North Atlantic region, Europe and North America, during its first 4 centuries, has become a global phenomenon. Today, there are over 2 million Christians who identify as Anabaptists. Around 28% of those Anabaptist Christians live in North America. This means that around 72% live in the global south or majority world. Of those who are part of the Anabaptist world, and are part of the Mennonite World Conference, I should say, about 84% of Anabaptist Christians are from the majority world. This global reach has happened only in the last century or so. So how did this come to be? And what might we learn as to why Anabaptism has become such a global phenomenon? And, more importantly, what might we in North America learn from our global companions today? Now, I have to admit, from the start, that unlike the other 4 presenters, the lecturers, I'm not a historian. I'm a theologian. So this means that even though I'm asking the question, how did this come to be, I won't be able to answer it. And I don't plan on answering it, nor will I try to answer that. So I apologize for that right from the get-go. That project has already been done. What I will focus on are some of the ideas or trends that took place throughout the 20th century that may, hopefully, help us learn why Anabaptism has become such a global phenomenon. At the turn of the 20th century, tensions around the world were simmering. The Anglo-Boer War was raging in South Africa, where the British invented a new war tactic, the concentration camp, which created the shift towards this total war that Caleb mentioned briefly last week. It assumed that all citizens, not just combatants, were part of the war machine. Likewise, in Europe, tension was rising due to the growth of nationalism, as well as the increase of militarism to serve the agendas of these rising nationalisms and their imperial pursuits. As much as Mennonites have liked or wanted to, larger forces continued to affect them and their way of life. Even though Mennonites sought to be separate from the world and structured themselves in colonies that sought to act in many ways as closed communities, Mennonites learned that they were not as separate as they may have liked. In fact, as nations continued to emerge, seeking loyalty from their citizens, nationalistic fervor also seeped into Mennonite communities in Russia, throughout Europe, as well as in North America. When Russia declared war on Germany, for example, German-speaking Mennonites in Russia, ironically, quickly declared allegiance to their Russian fatherland. And yet, Mennonites also learned the fickle loyalty nations had or have for people who dared to embody a communal politic that could or would challenge the politics of the nation state. The Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, for example, brought significant persecution of Christians and ethnic minorities, despite the allegiance some Mennonites demonstrated to the Russian fatherland. The collectivization of land under the new communist regime, followed by the famine in 1920, called into question virtually every aspect of Mennonite life in South Russia. The terror and devastating famine in Russia in the years following evoked, probably for the first time, a global consciousness of solidarity. This led North American Mennonites to explore and initiate opportunities to send food and farming equipment to Russia or Ukraine to help fellow Mennonite siblings who were struggling. This was the birth of Mennonite Central Committee. In North America, the U.S. held off in entering the war for several years. When in 1917 the U.S. officially entered the war, Mennonites and those within the Anabaptist family largely held fast to its pacifistic stance of non-resistance during the initial stages of the U.S.'s involvement. But this was challenged as the nation state worked hard to provide a narrative that would shift the convictions of these young men. Young Mennonite men were conscripted into military training camps upon the government's promise that they would not be coerced into combatant service against their conscience. The War Department, however, in fact, intended to persuade as many pacifists as possible to join the war crusade. Secretary of War Newton Baker deliberately delayed the provision of non-combatant service opportunities for the men in training camps to allow time for conscientious objectors to be converted to the military crusade. Although some did abandon their non-resistant heritage, some scholars suggest that there were at least 5,500 men who declared themselves as conscientious objectors in the U.S. This at a time when the total number of Mennonites in the U.S. was around 50,000, apparently. Some of these young men accepted non-combatant roles and served in medical or supply and support services. Others were allowed to work on farm furloughs, while others went to Europe and served with the Friends Reconstruction Unit. A number were also court-martialed and were sent to prison for their conscientious objection. Here we see two pictures of the prisons at Fort Douglas in Utah and as well as the Fort Leavenworth in Kansas. Some COs were also used as test subjects during the war. Tests that included positional resiliency, as well as nutritional limits and needs. In other words, how few calories, in other words, does a human actually need to live? Due to this conflict that consumed those in the North Atlantic region, along with some of the other tensions and divisions that were emerging due to the rise of fundamentalism in the early years of the 20th century, some European Mennonites saw the need for Mennonites from different nations to come together and wrestle with what it means to be a community of faith that spans different nationalities, including the nationalities that were in conflict with each other. This led in June of 1925 to the first gathering of the Mennonite World Conference, which also commemorated the 400-year anniversary of the Anabaptist movement. The focus of this gathering was a desire for a new theological interpretation of the Anabaptist descent in 1525, recognizing how so much of Anabaptist and Mennonite history was written by detractors and opponents of that movement. The gathering in 1925 was also an effort to bring the Anabaptist tradition into a strong dialogue with Pietism, revivalism, and the theological work at the state universities in Europe. Already at this gathering, we hear the desire to recover the Anabaptist Vision, which was associated with Neff, and I don't speak German, I can't say his last name, Hendiges, don't know how to say it, and Jacob Craker, even before Harold Bender. Alfred Neufeld suggests that at least 4 characteristics were evident during this event. 1, a great solidarity with the suffering and persecuted Mennonite family in the Soviet Union. 2, a great desire to bring revival and new spiritual life to Mennonite congregations and the Mennonite tradition. 3, a search for spiritual inspiration among the life and testimony of the first Anabaptists of the 16th century, and a desire to be worthy of that heritage and legacy. And 4, the idea of faithfulness to Christ and their witness as a Christian counterculture. Interestingly, only one North American, H.J. Crable, the chairman of the General Conference, was present at the initial 1925 Mennonite World Conference gathering. By the time the Second World War came about, the nationalistic fervor, both in North America and Europe, was now part and parcel of the social ethos, and Mennonites were not immune to this. Thus, although there were more opportunities to serve in alternative ways as conscientious objectors when war broke out, largely due to the work of Mennonites and other peace church traditions after the First World War, many young Mennonite men also participated in the military. In other words, although more Mennonites served as COs than those who enlisted in the army, one can say that the Mennonite commitment to pacifism and the ways of peace was not as robust as we have sometimes made it out to be. This demonstrates how the desire to belong and be accepted in their particular country began to take precedence over their theological and faith commitments. It was in the midst of this, in 1943, when Harold Bender gave his presidential address to the American Society of Church History. The title of his lecture was The Anabaptist Vision. We already heard John Roth mention this text in his lecture several weeks back. This text became, in many ways, a cornerstone of Mennonite Anabaptist thought throughout the 20th century. As John reminded us, we are always embedded within a cultural context. Therefore, our remembering, our historiography, our telling of history is therefore led by the context in which we are and the questions that we're wrestling with. It is also important to note, as I hinted at earlier, that up to this point, much of Mennonite Anabaptist history was written by others outside of the Anabaptist movement and faith tradition. Mennonite historians like Bender sought, therefore, to give our own account of our own history. In his lecture, and remember that he's talking to the American Society of Church History, a group that is not part of the Anabaptist community, Bender tried to demonstrate how freedom of conscience, separation of church and state, and voluntarism in religion, traits that are, he argues, essential to democracy and Protestantism in North America, traits that many United Statesians sought to uphold during his time and thereafter, have their roots, he argued, in the Anabaptist movement. It's kind of a bold claim, eh? Bender then goes on to highlight 3 core traits of the Anabaptists. The first trait that Bender notes is the emphasis on discipleship. The great word for Anabaptists, he noted, was not faith, but following. Baptism was an outward expression of an inner experience and decision to follow in the ways of Christ. The second trait that Bender highlighted was that of a new concept regarding church, or what Bender described as a brotherhood of love. The church that the early Anabaptists introduced, argued Bender, was that of a voluntary membership and commitment to holy living and discipleship. And this voluntary community would seek to be separate and nonconformist to the world. Nonconformity to the world, argues Bender, was the negative expression of the positive requirement of discipleship. The third trait of Bender's Anabaptist vision was the ethic of love and non-resistance. And this applied, he argued, to all human relationships, with friends and with enemies. Bender notes, quote, "In this principle of non-resistance or biblical pacifism, which was thoroughly believed and resolutely practiced by all the original Anabaptist brethren and their descendants throughout Europe from the beginning until the last century. The Anabaptists were again creative leaders, far ahead of their times. In this antedating I didn't even know that was a word, antedating? Anyway, antedating the Quakers by over a century and a quarter. It should also be remembered that they held this principle in a day when both Catholic and Protestant churches not only endorsed war as an instrument of state policy, but employed it in religious conflicts, end quote. One of the key aspects of Bender's contribution is the way in which he articulated this Anabaptist vision as a realistic way of responding to the current realities and needs of the world, despite, ironically, the way in which he depicted the church needing to be separate from the world. A decade earlier, Reinhold Niebuhr, a Lutheran theologian, sought to provide a theological ethical framework based on realism. He argued that Jesus' way of being and his ethic of love may be the ideal that Jesus taught, and it ought to be what guides the individual. But because everyone is a sinner and we live in an immoral society, Jesus' ethic was not realistic in the way we structure society. Bender, however, sought to suggest that Anabaptism was indeed realistic and needed at that time, given the midst of the Second World War. For his time and context, Bender's articulated vision provided newfound life and energy within the Mennonite Anabaptist community. One could say that it too was a renewal movement of sorts. It offered a constructive vision as to what it meant to be an Anabaptist, as it provided an historical account of Anabaptist origins and the ideals it sought. In the midst of World War II, Bender's Anabaptist vision helped Mennonites shift their gaze from, to put it crassly, from their navel up, allowing them to see Anabaptism, or allowing them to see how Anabaptism might have something to offer the broader Christian church and the world. Now, as I'm sure you can see, and which John also helped highlight a couple of weeks ago, Bender's account offered, to put it mildly, a restorationist view, an account as to how the early Anabaptists and Anabaptism in general restored the quote-unquote true church. Bender offered a very optimistic generalization of the early Anabaptists and their origins. You can see how in this quote, Bender suggested that all Anabaptist brethren and their descendants throughout Europe, from the beginning until the last century, practiced the principle of non-resistance and biblical pacifism. Well, that just simply wasn't the case. And other Mennonite historians began to point that out in the second half of the 20th century as they problematized Bender's historiography of the 16th century origins of the Anabaptist movement. Bender also argued that for the Anabaptist, there could be no compromise with evil. Not surprisingly, I would argue that this too was not, and perhaps is not, true. We always make some kind of compromise, even if we do not know what the compromise might be. What's more, this depiction and expectation has the very real possibility of generating a dangerous power dynamic, especially for those who could be seen as deviating from the prescribed essentialist perspective regarding discipleship and the centrality of forgiveness and reconciliation. Bender's depiction of Anabaptism, in other words, provided a simplistic and an all too tidy account. I think it is helpful to take a couple of steps back to see the broader philosophical tendencies during this time. We could see how Bender was a product of his time as he provided an account influenced by modernism or the Enlightenment era, an account that sought to provide an overarching narrative, an all-encompassing narrative that left very little room for deviations or different realities or accounts within it. In the second half of the 20th century, as the philosophical trajectory shifted from modernism to postmodernism, We see how other Mennonite historians and theologians deconstruct Bender's meta-narrative and highlight more of the nuances and differences that did not neatly fit into Bender's account. After World War II, I'm going to get to that in a second. Nope. Let's go back there. After World War II, soldiers and COs returned home with new experiences and insights, both cultural and about the human condition around the world. This further shifted the gaze beyond ourselves and stirred a need to find ways to serve and witness to Christ's way of peace after such a bloody conflict. This led young United Statesian Mennonites to participate in post-war relief and reconstruction. Likewise, although some of the Mennonite mission boards emerged much earlier in the late 1800s and early 1900s, and a few North American Mennonite missionaries had already been sent internationally, there was a significant wave of Mennonite missionaries sent out after World War II. It's no coincidence, for example, that many hospitals and mental health institutions emerged around this time, as many COs served in a similar way during the war as part of their alternative service. This created opportunities to experience and learn from new and different cultures. And such experiences change you, and it changed them. They came back with different questions and a growing awareness of different global realities. These new cultural experiences and insights in the 50s and 60s led some young Mennonites to ask and explore fundamental questions related to Mennonite theology, the nature of the church, its mission, its policy, and its relation to society at large. A group of these young United Statesians, graduate students, relief workers, and missionaries called themselves, or were called, the Young Turks. They met regularly to wrestle with such questions. Every year they met. They began what became known as the Concern Pamphlet Series. And this group expressed concern and disillusionment with the Mennonite Church for its conformity to denominational life and inactivity in witnessing to Jesus' way of life. They were particularly offended with the church's vertical structures as represented by conferences, ministerial boards, and institutions. They were also frustrated with the way in which ethnicity was frequently confused with spiritual reality. Again, to put this into context, this Concern series overlapped with postmodernism and the emergence of post-structuralism. These are sometimes academics like these kind of confusing terms and so on and so forth. So I just want to explain for those who are interested and want things a little bit more complicated, just to explain this a little bit. Postmodernism was a philosophical movement that became aware of the different power dynamics that shaped one's perspective. It challenged the modern tendency of depicting some sort of overarching, seemingly objective meta-narrative that it assumed applied to everyone in the same way. Closely related to postmodernism was the concept of post-structuralism, which challenges the idea that truth is fixed and universal. Or put differently, it suggests that knowledge is shaped by a person's socio-political and economic context and position. Where we are determines what we see, and therefore what we know. This had an influence on some of the concerned theologians and Mennonite historical and theological work from the 60s to the 80s, perhaps even the 90s. And there was some good work in deconstructing some of what needed to be deconstructed, which made more room to learn from other contexts, cultures, and people, and the way in which they understood and embodied their Anabaptist faith. The Concern series ultimately helped to push Mennonites to be more active within society. This also shifted the way in which Mennonites began to articulate their understanding of peace. This new generation, instead of referring, for example, to non-resistance, began to portray peace as nonviolent resistance, largely because of their firsthand experience to suffering and violence, coupled with their biblical, theological, and historical studies. Later on, it shifted to peacekeeping, to peacemaking, and now we often refer it to peace building, right? It was a shift from a more passive to a more active understanding of being a peace people. What emerged from this concerned group was a vision of the church that was actively engaged with society, witnessing to a different way of life. They offered a vision of the church in which, as J. Lawrence Burkholder notes, quote, "Spirit supersedes structure, essence transcends form, and the simple resists the complex." The church was not to be understood as a building or as an institution, but as an intimate fellowship of believers within which interaction includes mutual support, Bible study, edification, and discipline, end quote. C. Norman Krauss and John W. Miller suggested that the church is where Christ is and not necessarily where the membership rolls are kept. Not necessarily where the preacher stands Sunday by Sunday to present his discourse, but where Christ is reigning in the midst of his gathered people. This theological wrestling with Anabaptist history and the renewed ecclesial imagination, that is the way in which the church was perceived, had significant missiological implications. It provided an alternative way in which Mennonites understood and participated in mission. In the 50s and 60s, a different missiological approach emerged, focusing on a missiology of presence, being present and walking with other Christians and people of other faiths or no faith. This has led to an incredibly rich 70-plus year history and relationship with African-initiated churches or independent churches in southern and western Africa, as well as with indigenous peoples in Latin America and Asia. The impetus for this missiological shift emerged by exploring what it means to be the church with others, which was not and is not denominationally determined. Put differently, it embodied an approach that did not assume that we are the ones who are the true bearers or who bring the true church. Precisely because of this alternative missiological posture arising out of an Anabaptist understanding of the church, many around the world desired to be part of this Anabaptist communion of faith. This more active and outwardly focused, socially conscious faith and vision of the church led North American Mennonites to engage, be present with, and learn from others around the world. Mennonites sought not only to serve, as they did in the post-year wars, but they sought ways in which they could more actively confront injustice and oppression and participate in the struggles toward peace and justice around the world through entities such as MCC as well as through some of the mission agencies. Although I could share many stories, due to time, I'm going to share two stories, that of the Mennonite Church in Colombia and the Mennonite presence and influence in South Africa. These are the two stories that I know best because of my time living there. In Colombia, the Mennonite Church was and continues to be a small body of maybe 1,500 people in a country of about 52 million. And yet, although that body was small and imperfect, their faith and their expression of it deeply shaped my own understanding of faith. They were active. Colombia has been experiencing an internal armed conflict since 1964, making it the longest-running armed conflict in the Western Hemisphere. And yet, in the midst of that context, this small little church body proved to be a beacon of light in the midst of the ongoing violence. Toward the beginning of their life as a church, they described themselves as a typical evangelical church focused on preaching the good news of salvation, but ultimately not responding to the needs, to the realities, and to the struggles of their people. When, however, they leaned into their Anabaptist faith convictions in the 1980s and asked what a Colombian Anabaptist expression of faith should look like within their context, they began to understand their dedication to Jesus, the Prince of Peace, as something that they were also called to emulate and actively witness in response to the ongoing violence. They walked with campesinos, with farmers, who were dispossessed of their land due to the ongoing conflict. They kept track of atrocities that occurred in the ongoing civil war, despite who was responsible for them, whether it was the guerrillas, the paramilitary, the military, or the government. They walked with and looked for ways to support those who were caught in the middle of the ongoing conflict. This small body even challenged and changed Colombian law and constitutional legislation pertaining to conscientious objection. They changed the Constitution in Colombia. Their example, their witness, and their influence far surpassed their numbers. Because of their steadfast witness to peace in the midst of the violence, the Colombian Mennonite Church was asked in 2006 to initiate an ecumenical and civic conversation between the guerrillas, FARC, and the government, as well as other churches, in exploring a potential peace plan for Colombia. This conversation was one of the precursors that led to the 4-year negotiation process that took place in Havana, Cuba, which resulted in the signing of the peace accords in 2016, bringing an end, officially at least, to the civil war in Colombia. Mennonites in Colombia provided a witness as to what it meant to be a church dedicated to Jesus' way of peace and the way it challenged and challenges the status quo and the logic of violence. In the South African context, Mennonite presence and involvement was not a highly visible part of the story, especially as Mennonites came to South Africa when the struggle against apartheid was well underway. Mennonites, in other words, in their desire to support and walk with those who were challenging injustice and violence, were just one more presence among others in challenging the injustices of apartheid. Thus, any account of Anabaptist Mennonite work and potential influence in the South African context must be held humbly, recognizing that more could have been and should have been done to challenge apartheid and its policies. And yet, as small of a presence that Mennonites had in the South African context, like in Colombia, Mennonite presence and thought has had a disproportionately significant influence in South Africa, especially among the theological and activist voices during the struggle against apartheid. Toward the latter part of the 20th century to today, 1970s and onward, Anabaptism, both in its theological expressions and the ways in which it was embodied, provided and continued to provide an alternative theological perspective and foundation that challenged apartheid and its social engineering project. It's important to remember that before it was political policy, apartheid was first and foremost a theology. And so to challenge the system and the theological foundation on which it rested, a new theological imagination was needed. And some of the leading theologians in South Africa saw Anabaptism as helpful as it offered a theological and alternative ecclesial or church expression and possibility in responding to apartheid's logic. 3 particular interrelated characteristics proved to be significant. First, Anabaptism provided a different view and understanding of the church that witnessed to a different political allegiance. Such an understanding provided an alternative in that it, 1, did not simply focus on an otherworldly understanding of salvation, nor 2, focused on simply altering the political dispensation of the country. In other words, who ruled and according to what policy. Anabaptist ecclesiology, or an Anabaptist understanding of the church, rather offered a vision of an embodied, visible community that pursued right relations. The world-renowned missiologist David Bosch, for example, who was deeply influenced by Mennonites, argued that the people of God is a pilgrim people, called out of the world. Foreignness is an element of its constitution. It is called to flesh out, already in the here and now, something of the conditions which are to prevail in God's reign. Thus, in embracing this calling, a calling in becoming a visible community that embodies Jesus' way of being, the church becomes an alternative community in the world. John de Gruchy, perhaps one of South Africa's most influential theologians, suggests that the Anabaptist witness to the world, and therefore their testimony to God's order for the world, derived from their struggle to be the church. Thus, the socio-political engagement of the church, de Gruchy notes, emerges from the gospel rather than secular norms, values, and pragmatism. In particular, the Christian and the church are called to take sides with the oppressed in the struggle for justice, but in ways which are consonant with the cross of redemptive suffering. Such a vision is overtly political in that it affected the way in which people would relate with one another, with creation, and with God. This would also affect the way in which one would struggle against the apartheid state. The way a community walked mattered just as much as its emancipatory vision. The second characteristic, which is closely related to the first, is an alternative understanding of power that South Africans found curious about Anabaptism, along with the way in which Mennonites embodied it. Rather than viewing power negatively and therefore something to avoid, which tended to be the perception of more evangelical churches, or that the state was the only legitimate body that had and could exercise power, Anabaptism fed an understanding whereby everyone was an agent of power. Everyone had power. In this way, Anabaptism shares, albeit theologically, a commonality with the South African struggle cry, Amandla, awe tu, which is the power is ours. One did not have to wait to embody now the future that one desired. Put differently, one could already live and participate in the future envisioned. One did not have to wait until the government changed to do this. And third, Anabaptism provided a deeper, more robust eschatological or end times perspective or vision that nourished and shaped the way in which those committed to such an expression of faith challenged and struggled against the apartheid system. Such a perspective provided and provides a vision of shalom, holistic, political, economic, social, racial togetherness and wellness, along with an emancipatory politics required to embody and live into such a vision. It assumes that we must embody now that for which we hope. But because our cause is grounded in the not yet, the struggle continues until that time comes. Okay, let me wrap up. In philosophy, there's a joke that says, once you start deconstructing, you never stop. In the latter parts of the 20th century, there was some good, and I would argue needed work in deconstructing aspects of the Anabaptist narrative, including Bender's Anabaptist Vision, and some of its constructed power dynamics that were created. My fear, however, I was going to say to be honest, and I always give my students a very hard time to say to be honest, because then it's like, are you not being honest before? So I have to catch myself here. My fear, however, is that this process has continued to the point where we are in danger of losing any vision in what Anabaptism might mean. In our attempt to challenge the Anabaptist vision, my fear is that we are approaching a point where we can't articulate an or any Anabaptist vision. For some, for example, the notion of Anabaptism has largely become meaningless precisely because of the way it has been hollowed out. For example, it's not uncommon to hear someone refer to Anabaptism followed by whatever that means. The irony is that in critiquing Bender, we continue to rely on his essentialism in trying to understand what Anabaptism might mean. Or put differently, we have come to the point where we can demonstrate what it is not, but we struggle to articulate what it is. Arnold Snyder, a Mennonite historian and one of my profs at Conor Grable, who was perhaps one of the most ardent critics of Bender. You cannot blame him for not critiquing Bender. He did, all his career. Wrote a fantastic paper around the time when he was about to retire, where he asked whether he and others have been giving the church bread or stones. What's more, because of our growing distance from life and death struggles, perhaps largely because of our general affluence when compared to the rest of the world, Anabaptism too easily becomes a concept that we can debate rather than an embodied way of life. Our global companions, however, experience Anabaptism as a life-giving, emancipatory way of being in the world. In November, I was part of a Mennonite World Conference solidarity visit that Mennonite pastors from Myanmar requested. Myanmar is embroiled in an ongoing civil war. Several years ago, the military overthrew the democratically elected government and placed a military-appointed president and administration. Human rights violations have increased, especially as the new military-backed government, or junta, cracked down on any dissent, trying to eliminate all opposition. This has led to significant attacks and killings, arbitrary detentions, the displacement of people from their homes, curtailed freedom of expression and or assembly, leading to anxiety around gathering for worship services and more. The junta also introduced mandatory military service. What is the role of the church in such a context? What does it mean to be dedicated to Christ's way of peace amid these realities? These were the questions that the church leaders from Myanmar wanted to wrestle with. And fascinatingly, the more they explored, the more they learned about, and the more they wrestled with what it meant or what it means for them to witness to an Anabaptist expression of faith within their own context, the more energized they got in how to respond to their context. I would humbly suggest that we have much to learn from our global siblings. I hope to see you all in Europe for the Mennonite World Conference gathering in May. Amen.
All right. We've got plenty of time for questions. You can't go from the podium so soon. Sorry. Questions for Andrew.
Just one question. Can you explain the apartheid theology a little bit more?
Can I explain apartheid theology? Yeah. In October, I was with a group with Just Peace Pilgrimage that went to South Africa, and so we introduced a group of 18 people to the story and to the realities of South Africa and to our friends over there. Apartheid emerged in the late 1940s after already hundreds of years of colonization and racial segregation that was already in place. But in the 1940s, the system of racial segregation became law. And so that became known as apartheid. And so from the late 1940s on, they had this system of racial segregation where people could belong, where people could live, where people could work, etc. And so every single place in South Africa, from a small little town like Singer's Glen to Washington, like to a big town like Johannesburg, or a big city like Johannesburg, every single place was separated or segregated into places where different race groups could live. And so they had four race groups that were kind of identified, or that people were kind of boxed into. So you had blacks, you had Indians, and Indians by people that were brought over as indentured servants in the 1860s from India, largely to work the sugar plantations. You had whites, and then you had coloreds, quote-unquote coloreds, or people of mixed race. And so every town had a whites-only area, and then a colored township, an Indian township, and a black township. And so this took place through the late 1940s until 1994, when it was officially abolished. But if you go there today, I mean, the segregation and the realities, and even more, the imagination is still present, right? But this was built on a theological framework and foundation. They read the Old Testament very, very literally, and especially, for example, the Tower of Babel. And so the Tower of Babel, God separated them into different nations and into different languages. And so the white people in South Africa decided and said, well, that is God's will. And so they separated. And so apartheid was this notion, the way in which the white Afrikaners tried to articulate apartheid was this policy of quote unquote good neighborliness. Does that sound familiar? Good neighborliness. And so they separated and segregated everybody within South Africa. Now, in 1913, so this is before apartheid, 1913, after the Anglo-Boer War, the people from English descent and the people from Dutch descent, the Afrikaners, came together to form the Union of South Africa. That was in 1910, sorry. 1913, there was the Land Act, where they captured, or they took 85% of the land and kept it for 15% of the white population. The 85% of black, colored, and Indian South Africans were put into homelands. That was about 15% of the land in South Africa. And the homelands that they were put in were not the best or good farming land or good land at all, right? So that was in 1913. And so in 1940, the official policy of apartheid emerged. And it had this notion, this theological imagination as to this was a godly ordained thing, right? And so the Dutch Reformed Church in particular worked very closely with the National Party, who were the ones that instituted apartheid. And they worked the joke was that the Dutch Reformed Church was the prayer room or the prayer house of the politicians. So they worked they worked hand in glove, right? And then for Mennonites, like this is kind of the embodiment of that Christendom kind of relationship, right? The church and state working in tandem with each other. Yeah, I mean, apartheid is an Afrikaans word that meant apartness. And it was very much kind of justified by and supported by the Dutch Reformed Church. That was a slip there. The Dutch Reformed Church. Now that being said, I mean, white South Africans, all of them benefited and had a significant amount of privilege because of the apartheid system. And so you had the Anglican Church and other churches, the Baptist churches, etc. I mean, first of all, they were all racially, they all became racially distinct from one another. So you had a white Baptist church and a black Baptist church, for example, etc. Right? And so although some of the other churches would challenge, they would often say that they disagreed or they didn't like they also benefited from it as well. And so So for a long time, their challenge wasn't, especially within the white community, wasn't as vociferous, wasn't as strong as it perhaps could have been, right? But that being said, I mean, a lot of the English-speaking churches, Anglicans, Baptists, no, it's not Baptists, Anglicans, Methodists, etc., many of those that were part of the South African Council of Churches became kind of a strong oppositional voice to the apartheid government.
In your description of post-structuralism, you noted that knowledge was shaped by social, political, and economic contexts. What was missing there was theological context.
Yeah.
Is that something that you overlooked, or
Yes.
you had reasons for
No.
not? All the things you have said have indicated that theological context is very important in shaping knowledge.
Yeah. No, that's right. Thank you for pointing that out. Total carelessness.
Andrew, you said something to the effect that Bender presented non-resistance as a realistic option.
Yeah.
Help me understand that. I always thought he operated very much in a two kingdoms theology, that non-resistance was a confessional statement, even an eschatological one. What did it mean to say he presented it as a realistic option?
That's an excellent question, and I'm not
I
sure.
was raised thinking it was a very unrealistic option.
I mean, remember that he's giving this lecture during, like in the midst of World War II, right? And so in some ways, he's countering Niebuhr's kind of, the father of realism. He's countering Niebuhr's realism, right? And saying, look at what's happening. Like this is, even if it is an ideal vision, it's one that is needed and potentially actually one that will allow us to live in peace, because obviously the other forms are not actually doing it, right?
Did he articulate that?
Yeah, in the Anabaptist, towards the end of the Anabaptist, in his little booklet, he refers to Anabaptism as a realistic option. Yeah.
Oh, you carefully, and I think was helpful to talk about what's happening in Anabaptism in South Africa and Colombia. I'd like to move back and ask you the hard question about North America, especially in our context. Would you agree that the contemporary Anabaptist congregations that we represent in this room are not flourishing? And if so, why?
I don't want to answer that. I don't want to equate flourishing with what might be or might not be happening, because too often I think flourishing assumes numerical growth, and if we're not growing numerically, then all of a sudden we don't feel as though we're flourishing. And I want to tease that out and say I don't think that the two. I mean, Colombia is a small. The Colombian Mennonite Church is a small community, right? And yet they are, I would say, very, very active and flourishing. South Korea. I was just in a year and a half ago. I visited the Mennonite Church in South Korea, and you walk around and you're just like, it's just amazing what it is that they're doing. They have a publishing house. They have a Korean Anabaptist Center. They have there's an MCC office that's there. They have an intentional community and farm. They have the stuff that they're doing around restorative justice and peace building and so on and so forth is absolutely amazing. And so I asked one day, it was like, how many Mennonites are there in South Korea that allow you to do all this? 34? Like what? I think that there's 34 baptized members, but I think that more actually come to the worship services or whatnot. But it is not, anyway, it's not a large community. But I would say, when you're looking at this, I would consider that as thriving and very active. So I want to be careful with how we kind of equate those two things. I think my concern is that we forget. And part of the reason why I focus so much on the church is precisely because we forget what it means to be a community and the ways in which that gets expressed in different ways. And when we forget the community to which we belong and the people that help us form and help us shape and help us participate in what God is doing within this world, we begin to find and look at ways in which we can kind of go about it alone. And I think that within the North American context, that the individualism that exists within the North American context, and I would say especially within the U.S. context, is very, very strong. And it's one of those, I think that piece that individualism has seeped into, not just in our own minds, right, and in our own lives, but also ironically, in the lives of institutions as well. So we have institutions that seek to go about it alone and seek and kind of embody that individualism without paying attention to the larger kind of realities and how we can and should perhaps walk together, right? So that's that kind of individualism aspect would be another thing that I would kind of point at. I think one of the things that it didn't make it into this evening's lecture, but one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot is how, for example, Mennonites today and historically have used, or the roles of confessions within Mennonite history. Within the Schleitheim Confession, right, 1527, there's a Schleitheim Confession, 7 articles. This is what we believe. These are some of the kind of core things that we kind of have, that we believe and kind of has shaped our theological understanding and so on and so forth. Very monumental, first confession, etc. What we often don't focus on within the Schleitheim Confession is the preamble. How many people have read and know the preamble of the Schleitheim Confession? Well, there's your homework for tonight. Because in the preamble, there's something very fascinating that it says. It says, on these 7 things we have come to agree. It doesn't mean, and it doesn't suggest, I mean, they could have disagreed about a lot. There could have been a lot of things, hundreds of things that they disagreed on. But on these 7 things, we have come to agree. And that was significant, and so they wrote it down. The Mennonite World Conference, 7 core convictions, emerged precisely in that same way. I mean, we are different than many of our Mennonite siblings around the world. And there's a lot that makes us different. And yet those 7 core convictions emerged precisely because we asked everybody that is part of Mennonite World Conference, what are some of the kind of key aspects of your faith? And on these core convictions, these 7 core convictions, we have come to agree. So there's a lot that we differ with the church in Kenya. There's a lot. I mean, there's a couple of people here that were in South Africa with me in October. Ask them about their worship service in the BIC church on the Sunday morning. One of the biggest BIC churches in South Africa. Loud, incredibly loud, and just, I would imagine, something that was very, very different, and perhaps for some of them very uncomfortable about that experience. And yet we're part of the same communion, and we have come to agree on these 7 core convictions. Doesn't mean that we don't disagree about stuff. We do, right? Thomas Finger he has this wonderful paper that looks at confessions of faith in a Mennonite perspective as living letters. And he looks at the history of Mennonite confessions of faith and the way in which those confessions have been unifying documents. They were written as documents, or they were written as ways of unifying different factions of Mennonites together. So the 1995 Confession of Faith in a Mennonite Perspective, for example, brought together the Mennonite Church and the General Conference, right? And he goes on and lists and looks at the ways in which Mennonite confessions historically have operated in many, many ways in that way. We, however, then turn to those confessions and we frankly we start to weaponize them, right? Or we start to kind of use them as weapons and as dogmas. But here it says, ... But we fail and we forget to see that as living letters. So my question within the North American context, right, is what are understandings, beliefs, what are some of the theology that we can agree on? And can we take the time to be with people that we disagree with in order to explore even what we disagree with, to see if we can find those things that we can agree on? I think that would go a long way, personally.
Last question here. I'm going to go over here.
So while you're talking, I've been to several Mennonite World Conference gatherings. The first one was when I was 16. I went to Wichita, And I got baptized so that I could take communion at that gathering. And I remember it opened up my eyes. I felt so excited about being Mennonite. Like before that, I don't think I was that excited about it. I became really excited about it at that gathering. And I remember the communion was like in a football field, and there were like thousands of people going to take communion. But what is it about Mennonite World Conference where you feel this sense of unity, and it's so beautiful, but then there seems to be so much division within our country with the Mennonite groups? And I'm sitting by Kevin King, and he's Mennonite disaster guy, and there's a lot of unity there too. So, is there unity in Mennonite World Conference? You're a big part of that.
I don't know. This is what I describe. It just may very well be a miracle. And hallelujah to that. I think that within Mennonite World Conference, there is a larger vision of who we can be together and who we are together. In South Africa, there's this beautiful phrase called Ubuntu, which comes from this. It's not they created a software system called Ubuntu as well. It's not that. But Ubuntu comes from this phrase, Umuntu Ubuntu Gabantu, which means a person is a person because of other people, right? This notion of interconnectedness and finding ways in which we are interconnected, I think is a very strong component and element of Mennonite World Conference. There are tensions within Mennonite World Conference, undoubtedly. And interestingly, a lot of that comes from, or some of the tension is around kind of the economics. Like, how do we embody a just and fair system, recognizing the disparity and lack of equity around the world? How do we help each other out? And how do we help our siblings who live in other parts of the world who don't have as much as we do? Right? So there are tensions around that, precisely because in the North American context, this goes back to this question, in the North American context, a lot of institutions are feeling, how do you call that? Their belts are tightening? No, they're feeling constrained financially. And so the idea of giving more than they should or can or any of that kind of stuff is a difficult conversation in the North American context because they feel constrained about that. And yet at the same time, right, like the economic levels and the economic prosperity and so on and so forth are just so very different. And so it's a challenge. It's difficult. But I mean, beautiful things happen when we get together with people who are different than us, where we can learn from each other. Cesar Garcia, Cesar Garcia. Cesar Garcia, the General Secretary of Mennonite World Conference, tells this story often about how, like, he went to Mennonite World Conference in Zimbabwe. And as they were there, they were, being transported to and fro, and there was one point where he was sitting beside a brother, and he was struggling with kind of the smell that was kind of wafting, and he was kind of struggling, right? And I mean, and Cesar is a Colombian, and so he's he will be very kind of put together, and he'll smell very nice. And so they were kind of sitting down, and then at one point, Cesar said, "Look, brother, I'm sorry, but I'm really struggling kind of with the smell right now." And he turned to him and he's like, "I'm glad you said that because I am too." And Cesar was like, "What do you? Oh." Something happens when we encounter somebody who is different than us, right? And something beautiful happens. And something beautiful happens when we recognize not only that we're different, but actually that we have different gifts and we need each other if we want to walk together and support one another in our journey. So, in my opinion, that's part of the magic, that's part of the miracle of Mennonite World Conference that I absolutely Love.
Though we falter and we fail, Christ will still renew us. By the Holy Spirit's power, God is working through us. Menno Simons wrote these words nearly 500 years ago. Let's sing them together. It's number 797. And please stand if you're able. We are people. We are people of God's peace as a new creation. Love unites and strengthens us at this celebration. Sons and daughters of the Lord, serving one another, a new covenant of peace binds us all together. We are heralds of God's peace for the new creation, and by grace the word of peace reaches every nation. Though we falter and we fail, Christ will still renew us. By the Holy Spirit's power, God is working through us. We are children of God's peace in His new creation, spreading joy and happiness through God's great salvation. Hoping, bringing Spirit meek in our daily living. Peace with everyone we sing, good for evil giving. We are servants of God's peace, of the new creation. Choosing peace we faithfully serve with heart's devotion. Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, confidence will give us. Christ the Lord is our defense. Christ will never leave us. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.